The notice was folded in half and slipped under my door sometime during the night. The kind of thing that only happens after midnight when the building finally settles. I found it the next morning when I almost stepped on it in my socks, still half asleep heading to make coffee. I picked it up without thinking, unfolded it, read the same line 3 times. 10 days, that's what I had. 10 days before the place I had called home for 2 years in Louisville, Kentucky would legally no longer belong to me. I set the paper on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker and just stood there while the machine ran. The apartment wasn't much. 2nd floor of a converted brick building in the Highlands neighborhood. 1 bedroom, hardwood floors that groaned near the bathroom. A kitchen barely wide enough to stand in with your arms fully out. But I had learned something in those weeks before. Small things become enormous when you're about to lose them. The smell of that apartment, the old wood and the coffee and the faint memory of every meal I had ever cooked in there, felt like something I hadn't appreciated until that exact moment. My name is Dern. I'm 28 years old, and until 4 months before that notice appeared under my door, I had been a line cook at a restaurant called Barrel and Stone on Frankfort Avenue. Not the head chef, not a manager, just a line cook. But I was a good one, and I say that without vanity because it's just the truth. I knew every burner on that line, every pan, every prep cycle, every ticket pattern on a Friday night when the dining room was full and the printer wouldn't stop. I had worked there for 3 years, and I was proud of the food we put out. Locally sourced ingredients, honest Southern cooking with a little edge to it. The kind of place that earned regulars who came back, not because it was cheap or convenient, but because the food was actually worth sitting down for. Then the restaurant closed. Not because the food got bad. Not because of bad reviews or a slow season, or anything that had anything to do with any of us who worked there. The owner got into a legal dispute with his building's landlord over a lease renewal. Something about property assessments and renovation liability that became a full-blown argument neither side would settle. It dragged through the summer and into the fall, lawyers and letters and court postponements, and somewhere in the middle of it, he made the decision that fighting it while keeping the restaurant open was going to cost him everything he had left. He called me on a Thursday night. His voice was flat and very tired. He said he was sorry, and I believed him, and the next morning I showed up, and there was a closure notice taped to the door, and a padlock on the back entrance where I had gone in every morning for 3 years. I stood in the alley behind Frankfort Avenue for a long while before I got back in my car. After that, the months moved the way bad months do, slowly and quickly at the same time, so that each day felt long but entire weeks seemed to vanish without anything actually changing. I filed for unemployment. I sent applications to every restaurant, hotel kitchen, catering company, and food service operation in the Louisville metro I could find, and then I expanded the search to the suburbs, and then to southern Indiana. I drove to 2 interviews that I felt good about walking out of. Neither one called back. The responses that did come arrived as polite rejection emails, the kind where you can feel the person on the other end was trying to be decent, but didn't have anything better to offer than their well wishes. The bills had no feelings about any of this: rent, utilities. The minimum payment on a credit card I'd been carrying since my first year out of culinary school, the internet connection I needed to keep applying. All of it kept showing up right on schedule, completely indifferent to the state of my checking account. By January, what I had saved, which had never been much to begin with, was down to a number that stopped feeling like money and started feeling like a countdown. So many days until 0. So many sunrises before something had to change or I would be out of options. And then one morning, there was a folded notice under my door. I want to be honest about what those 10 days felt like, because I think the honesty matters here. There's a version of a story like this where the person in crisis stays sharp and clear-headed, where the pressure makes them focused and productive. That was not me. Those 10 days were some of the heaviest of my life. I went through the motions, sent out 2 more applications, made a few calls, ate food I barely tasted at a kitchen table I'd already started thinking of as someone else's, but underneath all of it was a kind of low, constant static that I couldn't shake loose. The particular shame of being 28 years old and not being able to pay rent. The exhaustion of knowing that nothing about the situation was your fault and understanding, at the same time, that doesn't change anything. The worst of it wasn't even the practical problem. It was the silence of carrying it alone. The way I passed neighbors in the hall and smiled and knew they didn't know. And the effort of keeping it that way cost me something I couldn't quantify. By day 5, I had started going through my things. Not packing exactly, more like assessing. What would fit in my car if it came to that? What could go into storage if I could scrape together the first month's payment? What I would probably have to leave behind. The process was surprisingly quiet, not dramatic, not loud, just slow and hollow, the way hard things sometimes go when you've run out of the energy for anything bigger. I was not going to call my parents. That was settled in my mind, firm the way only certain decisions are. My dad had driven long-haul trucks for most of his adult life. My mom had worked checkout at a Kroger for 20 years. They were good people who had stretched themselves to give me what they could when I was young, and I was not going to call them now at 28, with a problem as basic as rent, and make myself into another weight they had to carry. The thought of it sat in my chest like a stone. I had already decided not to pick up. The afternoon of day 6, I was sitting on the floor of my bedroom going through a box of things I'd brought home from the restaurant, a worn apron, a knife roll, a recipe notebook I'd kept for 3 years with handwritten notes in the margins, when I heard a knock at my front door. It was a soft knock. Not demanding, almost like the person on the other side wasn't entirely certain they had the right apartment. I set down the knife roll, got up off the floor, and went to answer it. Standing in the hallway was a woman I recognized but had only ever exchanged a few words with in the entire time I'd lived in the building. Dorothy Wainwright. She owned the place. Dorothy was in her mid-60s, with short silver-gray hair cut practical and close to her head. She was wearing a canvas barn coat over a green flannel shirt, like she had been doing something outdoors before she came upstairs. No clipboard, no folder, nothing official. She just stood there with her hands halfway in her jacket pockets, looking at me with an expression I couldn't immediately read. It wasn't cold. It wasn't warm either. It was more like careful, the look of someone paying close attention to something. My stomach clenched. I assumed she had come to confirm the timeline to make sure I was on track to actually vacate. I started to say something, some variation of yes, I know, I'm handling it. But she spoke first. She asked if I had a few minutes to talk. I stepped back and told her to come in. Dorothy moved through the apartment slowly, the way people do when they're actually looking, rather than just moving through space. I could see her notice the open box on the floor, the small pile of things I'd started pulling from the closet and leaving near the wall. She didn't say anything about them. I offered coffee because I didn't know what else to do with my hands, and she accepted. And we ended up at the kitchen table with 2 mugs, while the last of the afternoon light came in through the window above the sink. She told me she had been in Knoxville visiting her sister. She went several times a year, apparently, and had only just gone through the building's paperwork since getting back. When she saw my name in the eviction file, she said she'd spent a moment trying to place it. Then she remembered a conversation we'd had once in the parking lot, maybe 8 or 9 months earlier. I had mentioned working at Barrel and Stone's. She said she'd eaten there a few times. She liked the food. Then she looked at me and asked what had happened. I don't have a clean explanation for why I told her everything. I had spent weeks keeping the whole shape of it close, not telling the neighbors, not posting about it anywhere, barely letting myself think through all of it clearly at once. But something about that kitchen table, and the 2 mugs of coffee, and the specific way she was sitting there, not looking at her phone, not glancing past me, actually looking at me, something about all of that just broke something loose. I told her about the restaurant closing, about the legal dispute that had nothing to do with any of us on the line, about the applications and the interviews and the particular silence of a rejection email that arrives at 4 in the afternoon when you've been waiting on it since Tuesday morning. I told her about the night in January when I'd driven to Walgreens at 11 o'clock because I had a headache and the transaction at the register had been declined, and I'd stood there counting change out of my jacket pocket whilst a cashier looked away to give me some dignity in it. I told her about the shame that followed me everywhere, the specific kind that has nothing to do with anything you did wrong and somehow still manages to attach itself to you like it does. When I stopped talking, my coffee was cold. I realized I had been gripping the mug with both hands. Dorothy nodded slowly. She wrapped her own hands around her mug and looked at the table for a moment. Then she said something I wasn't expecting. She told me she used to run a catering business. Not a large operation, she made that clear right away. For about 12 years, she had run a small catering company out of this building. When she had first bought the property, the basement had a large open space she'd built out into a commercial kitchen, properly permitted and up to health code, because she'd had a plan from the beginning. She had started the catering business as a side operation and grown it over time into something that employed 6 people at its highest point. Corporate luncheons, private events, some small wedding receptions. She had built it slowly and deliberately, and she was proud of it. She'd sold the business 4 years ago when the physical demands got to be too much for her knees. She'd sold most of the equipment, but the kitchen itself was still down there, still permitted, still up to code, sitting completely idle for 4 years. She paused after she said that, and I waited. She had been trying to figure out what to do with that space for about a year, she said. She had an idea, something she'd been turning over in her mind since she retired. But she hadn't been able to get it off the ground. The problem was always the same. She needed someone with real professional kitchen skills to run it, not a hobbyist. Not someone just interested in cooking. Someone who had actually worked a kitchen under pressure and knew what it meant to produce food consistently and safely. She looked at me across the table and asked if I wanted to hear what she had in mind. I know that feeling, the one where someone might be about to offer you something real, and you don't know whether to let yourself open up to it or to keep the wall up because it hurts less when nothing comes of it. I told her to go ahead. What Dorothy had been thinking about was a free cooking program for teenagers in the neighborhood. Not a formal class, not a school curriculum, just a Saturday morning, a few hours, where she would cover the ingredient costs and I would teach basic skills. How to hold a knife, how to cook a real meal from scratch, how to build something out of a few simple ingredients without following a box or a bag. She had lived in this neighborhood for 30 years, had watched the blocks change across multiple generations, and she believed, practically and without sentiment, that one of the most overlooked things missing for a lot of young people here was simply the knowledge of how to feed themselves. Not gourmet cooking, just the foundation. She'd tried to launch it twice, once with a culinary school student, once with a retired cafeteria manager from a middle school. Neither had worked out for different reasons. What she was offering me was this. She would withdraw the eviction notice. She would let me stay in the apartment at no charge for 3 months. In exchange, I would run the Saturday morning program in the basement kitchen. She was also offering me access to the kitchen during the week on my own time to use for whatever professional purpose I could build. A prep business, a meal delivery operation, whatever I could get going on my own. The only non-negotiable was the Saturday program. If I said yes, I showed up every Saturday morning, prepared, no exceptions. She said it was not charity. She said she had tried charity before and found it unsatisfying for everyone involved. What she wanted was someone who would take the work seriously, because it mattered to them, not out of obligation. The kitchen went quiet. I could hear someone walking down the hallway outside my door, and then the footsteps faded, and it was just the hum of my refrigerator and the 2 of us at the table. My first response, if I'm being truthful, was not gratitude. It was something closer to suspicion, and directly behind that, a wave of self-doubt so cold and immediate it almost came out of my mouth. I was a line cook who couldn't pay rent. I had spent 3 years on a hot line, not mentoring anyone, not teaching anyone anything. The idea of being responsible for a group of teenagers on Saturday mornings, for their experience, their safety, whether they walked out with something of value or not, felt precisely like the wrong job for the wrong person at the worst possible time. I told her I wasn't sure I was the right fit. She looked at me without changing anything in her expression. Then she said, "The best people for this kind of work are usually the ones who are certain they're not ready." I thought about what she'd said all the way through that evening, made myself dinner, pasta with whatever I had left in the cabinet, and sat at the table after and thought about the offer, and what it meant about her that she had come upstairs at all, and what it would mean about me if I said no. The next morning, I knocked on the door of her first-floor office and told her I was in. The first Saturday, 3 kids showed up. Jalen was 15 and walked into the kitchen with his shoulders up and his arms crossed, the posture of someone who had already decided he wasn't going to be impressed by whatever this was. Priscilla was 13 and had never held a chef's knife in her life, which she stated plainly and without embarrassment in the direct way that only very secure 13-year-olds can manage. And there was a quiet kid named Omar who sat on a stool near the prep table and said almost nothing the entire morning, but watched everything I did with a focus and seriousness that I found slightly unnerving at first. I taught them a simple pasta, garlic and olive oil, cherry tomatoes we halved, finished with parmesan and some fresh parsley. I showed them how to salt water, how to tell when something is actually boiling and not just steaming, how to guide the knife with your knuckles so you keep your I talked too fast in the beginning. I used terms I had to double back and explain, things I had been saying in kitchens for years, without thinking about the fact that they weren't obvious. At one point, Jalen burned his forearm lightly on the edge of a hot pan. Not seriously, just a glancing touch, and there was a terrible suspended moment where I watched him decide what to do with it. He pressed his lips together. He let me rinse it under the cold tap and check it, and then he went back to what he had been doing. By the end of the morning, all three of them were eating something they had made with their own hands. Priscilla ate 2 full plates. Omar waited until everyone was done and then asked me, in a quiet voice, what the ratio of oil to pasta should be if you wanted it less dry, and the specificity of the question told me something about the way his mind worked. I drove home that afternoon thinking that was not as bad as I thought it was going to be. By week 3, there were 9 kids in that kitchen. By week 6, 14. Dorothy had started coming down to sit in the back for a few minutes each session, not interfering, not saying anything, just watching. She brought a small notebook sometimes and wrote things in it that I never asked about. During the week, I was using the kitchen to build a small prepared meal delivery operation. Nothing elaborate. A rotating menu of 4 or 5 dishes I'd cook in volume, packaged into containers, delivered Wednesday and Friday evenings to people who found me through a neighborhood Facebook group. The first week I got 20 orders, the following week 27. I bought an insulated bag to carry them, then 2 more. It wasn't a business yet, it was barely the outline of one, but after months of waiting for some external door to open, having something in my own hands that I was building, even if it was small, felt like being able to breathe again. Then on a Saturday morning in late April, a man came into the kitchen near the end of the session and stood near the back wall with his arms at his sides, watching. He was in his late 40s, dressed neatly for a Saturday, and he watched the class with an expression that was attentive and completely unreadable. After the kids filed out, he came forward and introduced himself, Frank Tillman, Priscilla's father. She had apparently been telling him about the Saturday program for weeks, and he had decided to come see it for himself. We talked in the kitchen while I cleaned up. I told him about Barrel and Stone, the closure the month since. He ran a catering and corporate meal services company that handled lunch programs and private events across the Louisville metro area and into southern Indiana. He spoke in the direct, economical way of someone who had run a business long enough to have lost patience for anything that wastes time. He asked me what I was currently doing for income. I told him about the meal delivery operation, the Facebook group, the Wednesday and Friday runs, the insulated bags in the back of my car. He nodded. He said he'd been watching me manage 14 teenagers in a commercial kitchen for 2 hours on a Saturday morning, and he had a pretty good sense of what he needed to know. He asked if I'd ever worked corporate catering. I told him I had some event experience from my first kitchen job years ago, but that most of my background was restaurant line work. He said that was fine. He said what he was looking for was someone who could run a kitchen under pressure, who understood prep cycles and timing across multiple concurrent events, and who was reliable in the way that mattered, meaning they showed up and did the work without drama. 2 weeks later, I sat across from Frank in his office near the Louisville airport, a clean, organized room where everything was where it was supposed to be, and he offered me a position as kitchen operations supervisor, overseeing prep and production for his Thursday and Friday event contracts, with room to grow into managing additional days as the company expanded. The pay was better than I'd made at Barrel and Stone. The hours were predictable. For the first time in months, I could see a path forward that had more than one step visible at a time. I accepted before he finished the full sentence. Before I tell you what happened after that, I want to stop and ask you something directly. If this story has meant anything to you, if you've ever been in a place where everything felt like it was closing in, and you didn't know what was on the other side of it. Please share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And share one moment when someone else's kindness changed the direction of something in your life. Those stories belong out in the world. Subscribe to Mercy Stories if you haven't already, because more of these are coming, and they only reach the people who need them if someone passes them along. I started at Frank's company in May. I worked harder there than I had worked anywhere in years, not to prove anything to anyone, but because I finally understood clearly what the work was for. The Saturday program kept going. That was never in question. Dorothy and I had an agreement, and I kept it, but beyond the agreement, I had come to need those Saturday mornings in a way that was hard to explain. Something about showing up in that kitchen every week, watching kids discover that they were capable of producing something real with their hands, had become part of how I made sense of what had happened to me and why. Dorothy and I would cross paths occasionally, in the parking lot near the mailboxes, once in the laundry room, and she would ask how things were going. She was not the type to make a production of checking in. She had a particular way of nodding when you told her something was working, a single small nod, like she was recording a fact. I came to appreciate it as one of the most genuinely satisfying responses anyone ever gave me. One evening in November of that first year, I ran into her near the mailboxes and told her that Omar had started asking me questions about culinary school, that he was 16 and thinking seriously about it and wanted to know what path made the most sense. Something shifted in her face when I told her, something quiet and quick, and then it was steady again. She said, "That's what the whole thing was always for." 3 years have passed since that notice slid under my door. I don't work for Frank anymore, though I'm grateful to him in a way that time has only deepened. After 18 months at his company, Frank sat me down himself and told me he thought I had learned what he had to teach me. He said he believed I was ready to build something of my own, that I had been ready for a while, and he had been waiting for me to see it. He told me he would give me the best professional reference I could ask for, and that if I ever needed advice I should call him, and he meant it. I have called him twice, and both times he picked up and talked it through with me without making me feel like I was asking for a favor. Last spring I launched Ember Table Catering, registered in the state of Kentucky. A crew of 5 people, including me. We handle corporate lunch programs and private events in the Louisville metro area. In our first 8 months operation, we booked 41 events, a small number by most standards maybe, the most significant number I have ever been responsible for in my life. The Saturday cooking program is still running in that basement kitchen. Dorothy keeps the space available, and I show up every week. More than 200 young people have come through that kitchen over the past 3 years. Some stayed for a few sessions. Others have been there nearly every week since the beginning. Jalen, who walked in on the very first morning with his arms crossed and burned himself on a pan and decided not to make it into a scene, is 17 now and helps me lead the sessions. He wants to go to culinary school in Chicago. I have already told him I will write the letter when the time comes. Omar, who barely said a word that first morning, now asks questions I sometimes have to think hard before answering, which I consider one of the best signs I know. I don't think about the eviction notice the way I used to. For a long time, the memory of finding it under my door had a specific weight to it, a cold, sick feeling that came back whenever I let myself remember that morning. It doesn't have that weight anymore. What it has now is more like context, the thing that happened right before everything else began. What I understand now that I didn't know then is that the worst moments don't always announce themselves as turning points. They look like a folded piece of paper on the floor. They look like a soft knock from someone you barely know. They look like an offer that doesn't make any sense yet, from a direction you never would have thought to look. If you've made it to the end of this story, thank you for being here with me. Please subscribe to Mercy Stories if this meant something to you, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that things can still change. Like the video so that more people can find it, because stories like this one only travel as far as the people who carry them. And if you're sitting somewhere right now with your own version of that folded piece of paper, whatever yours looks like, I want you to hear this. I have been exactly where you are. I know how quiet that particular kind of hard can be. Hold on a little longer. Sometimes the door opens from the side you never expected.